Hello, how you doing? I'm Craig Parkinson. You are listening to the Two Shot Podcast. Sit yourself down, pop the kettle on. We're going to have a nice old chat. Who's it with this week? I'm going to tell you right now. It's Thursday, so that can only mean one thing. Well, actually, it means loads of things, really, doesn't it? Thursday, but right now it means one thing. It's episode 45 of the Two Shot Podcast with Mr. Dave Haslam. More of that in a sec. You're here. Fantastic. How are you? Everything good? Thanks so much for all your messages, by the way, and your emails about the awards. I'm sorry we haven't had time to get back to everybody yet, but we will. I promise. So what are you up to? You getting back to work after the bank holiday? Yeah, a short week, that's good. Is it half term? Maybe you're wrangling children, you don't know what to do with them. Or maybe this is your time now to put the kettle on, put your feet up and listen to the episode. Maybe it isn't. Who knows? Look, huge thanks to everybody who... we were in Bath last week for Bath Festivals. Who kindly invited the Two Shot Podcast to record a live episode there. And as the weather has been very unpredictable of late, it absolutely chucked it down. Excuse me. But it doesn't matter because, I don't know who... we sold out anyway. It was a fantastic night. And it was with Charlie Cooper from this country. It was going to be with Daisy and Charlie, but Daisy was stuck in London. She couldn't make it, but that didn't matter because we spent more time with Charlie, and we're going to do another episode with Daisy, so we're not going to miss out. But if you were there, you will know what an absolutely brilliant night it was, and we are going to put that as an episode soon-ish, I think. Anyway, it's coming soon, and it's an absolute belter. What else? Well, we might as well get down to it. So, a few months ago, the Charlatans were doing a takeover of Northwich, which is in Cheshire, and they called it North by Northwich. There were lots of bands there. The Charlatans were doing, I think, 4 consecutive nights of gigs, and then they were streaming it live all around the world, and it was a really big thing, and they asked us to do 2 live episodes, and we're very lucky to get Mr. Dave Haslam and the mighty Mr. PADDY CONSIDINE, and this is episode 45. Get your glow sticks ready. It's Mr. Dave Haslam. How the devil are you all? This is the Two Shot Podcast, and you join us here on a very special day. You know the day. It's where 2 people come together and we appreciate them. That's right, it's the Two Shot Podcast with Mr. Dave Haslam! You got that I was thinking about the royal wedding, yeah? You got, yeah, okay, that's fine. You know, we work these things out. We are here live at North by Northwich on this beautiful sunny day. Dave, how are you?
I'm very nervous.
Why?
Because the book tour officially starts on Tuesday. So this is like the first one that I've done.
Well, what I want to do is warm you up for them.
And also, you have a beautiful voice, Craig. And I feel a bit uncomfortable in the presence of your beautiful voice.
Dave, please. Look, Dave, it's fine. We're just chatting as friends. And what I was thinking was, because, does anybody listen to the podcast here? Oh, you do? Fantastic. So we've recorded about 50. And what keeps cropping up all the time, whether it's actors, writers, poets, whatever sort of creative work they do, music always comes into it. And it was quite funny because some people always say, oh, my mum and dad they influenced me so much because they put the Joni Mitchell and Jimi Hendrix. And then some people go, well, yeah, we had an M People CD and Clannad. That's all we had. So I didn't know where I got my musical taste from. So I suppose some people like Clannad. I don't know who, they're not here, it's great. So I suppose what I wanted to start by talking to you about was you growing up, and if your parents inspired or gave you anything musically?
Now, you see, I thought we were starting with me reading.
Oh, did you?
But as it happens, the thing I was going to read is exactly on, not exactly on that subject, but it would answer that question. But I would love to answer that question.
Okay.
I grew up in Birmingham. I came to Manchester in 1980 to become a student. And that choice was based purely on music. I was, by that time, a big fan of Factory Records. And I'd become obsessed, particularly with Joy Division. And as a sixth former, Joy Division kind of, at that age, 17, 18, Joy Division really hit me. You know, they really made an impact.
Yeah, me too.
And Ian Curtis actually killed himself in the run-up to my A-levels. And this is how, I think, weirdly, this is how everybody thinks of their life. You think of that, your life, you've got your life, and then you've got the life of the culture that you're interested in.
Yeah.
And I don't remember the royal weddings, but I remember the amazing moments in culture, you know, seeing David Bowie performing Starman on the TV, hearing John Peel announce the death of Ian Curtis. Those things, I can tell you where I was and what I was doing, and I was studying.
Can I ask you where you were when you heard of Ian Curtis's death?
Yeah, I was listening to the John Peel radio show, and he announced it on the Monday after, and I was in my bedroom at home. And he
in Moseley?
In Moseley, in Birmingham. And he began the show by saying that he'd heard the news that Ian had died. And in answer to your question, that news meant nothing to my parents. But that would have been the same, I think, for people when they heard that Kurt Cobain had died. That that name wasn't known to, to the previous generation. My parents were into music, but the interesting thing about them from that point of view was in 1963, they had 3 children under the age of 4.
Wow.
So first off, hats off to my mother for
popping those out.
For popping those out.
So to speak. It's not a medical term, but you get my drift.
And so at the moment when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones emerged, and that whole kind of, the birth of the teenager and the birth of the 60s and the rock and roll generation and all that, they had stuff to do. They had to look after the kids.
Yeah.
So actually, rock and roll and all that, they were probably just 5 years too early, or 5 years too late, whatever. But so they didn't understand what I was into. My elder sister was quite influential in my life musically. Her crew were into Neil Young and Rod Stewart and the Faces.
What's the age difference between you and your sister?
3 years.
Right.
And then my younger brother is now into Neil Young. So they were kind of folky. And but I was the curious teenager who was into and intrigued by the sense of what was an alternative. Not just musically, but culturally, politically, in every way.
Right.
There was something in my mindset from an early age where I felt bewildered/alienated by the mainstream culture. I would watch Saturday night TV, and I just wouldn't get, it ain't half hot, Mum. TV shows like that, they bewildered me.
It's not speaking to me.
No, it's not speaking to me, and the kind of mainstream, a lot of the mainstream stuff didn't. And so I just adventured in and tried to find other things, which is why I was listening to John Peel, because John Peel was key to that. And in the late 70s, you just have to follow whatever trail you could. You couldn't kind of go on the internet looking up alternative culture. You had to go out, find the alternative bookshop, the art house cinema, the little venue up the road with the weird new bands playing. And I was that person, and I did that little circuit, and that's how I became intrigued and obsessed by that world.
And do you find your people through that, the people who you connected with, who liked
that type of thing.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about growing up in any city is that finding your tribe.
Which, sorry to interrupt, but it comes up again and again on the podcast throughout everybody, actors, writers, everybody, they all talk about finding their tribe, finding their people, and then they start to grow. It's so important.
And that's why the venues were important, and the thing was that when I arrived in Manchester and when I went over to Liverpool, which I also did, I kind of realised I was replicating my mindset from Birmingham. So I remember I met my friend Pete Wiley, who was in a band called Wah Heat at that time, in 1980. And he met me off the train at Lime Street Station in Liverpool, and he took me to the Alternative Bookshop, the Art House Cinema, the photography gallery, Armadillo Tea Rooms. He showed me where Eric's Club was. And I realised that the way I'd created my own little world in Birmingham, he'd created his little world in Liverpool. And in Manchester, I was soon at Grassroots Bookshop and the Arban Cinema and, going to the Cypress Tavern and all kinds of venues to see smaller bands. And I realised that my connection, my roots and my community were not only the people who lived in my immediate surroundings, who I shared a postcode with, but also those people in those other cities who were, like me, looking for adventure and alternative ideas and culture, whether it be Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Newcastle, whatever. Or indeed, even as I later on in my life realised around the world there are people like that. But obviously when I was 18, I didn't know much about anything that was going on out there.
But isn't it funny? I remember when I first went to Manchester, and I wanted to go to Affleck's Palace because I was so influenced, and that's the place where you have to go, and I needed my pair of kickers. And you may know kickers, you may not. Just Google it. They were great shoes. They are great shoes. And I didn't have enough money for the kickers that I required for my uniform. And there was a pair in the sale, and they were about £29, which was kind of all I had, about 30 quid. And they were a salmon pink colour. They were quite a bold shoe for a young sort of 17-year-old.
Were they actually a girl's shoe?
They might have been girls' shoes, Dave. I had £30. I couldn't go back to Blackpool without a pair of kickers. I bought them, and they stayed in the box. I never had the balls to wear them out in Blackpool with my Joe Bloggs. I would have just looked like a complete nana. But, there's a uniform, isn't there? I remember when I went to Manchester for the first time, and I would walk past somebody who I thought shared my sensibilities, and we just caught eye, and there was a little nod, and you feel, oh, right, well, that's my tribe, that's my people. So you may think that my first question was an accident. It wasn't. Dave is now going to read exclusively for you an extract from his memoir, which is... When is it available, Dave?
It's out on Thursday.
It's out on Thursday.
Which, if you're listening to the podcast, that's Thursday, May the 24th, 2018.
He's not nervous at all. He's got this down pat. I'll hand this over to Dave. Thank you.
What I'm kind of thinking is that if this reading is too long, then obviously I won't read it again anywhere, because I'll learn from my experience, which is one of the things the book is about, learning from experience. But the other thing is you can edit it all out of the podcast, and we'll go straight from the salmon shoes into Joy Division.
I think if anything's getting edited out, Dave, it might be the salmon shoe story. I know you liked it, but, it may have to go.
Okay, so this is about being in Moseley and discovering alternative music, really through John Peel. And it's about a band in Moseley called the Au Pairs. There were a couple of bands locally that I got into. One was called the Prefects, and I went to see them play, and I thought they were amazing. And 3 weeks later, they split up. So I'm like, okay, I need another favourite ever band. And the Au Pairs became my next favourite ever band. And I love the fact that they were from where I was. They shared my street. I mean, I loved Iggy Pop and Debbie Harry and those people, but they were untouchable. It was like culture from a different place, which it was. And I knew I had a connection, but I didn't have as deep a connection as I did, with the au pairs. And that was what I mean about my mindset. So when I did arrive in Manchester, I was hoping to connect with local bands, just as I had in Birmingham. This is the book, page 33, and a third. In the post-punk period, the small independent label and DIY path to recording and releasing was well trodden. In September 1979, the au pairs glued together the sleeve of their first record themselves and sold copies locally, including at the alternative bookshop, Prometheus. Their manager, Martin Culverwell, ran their record label, which was called 021, the area code for Birmingham. I buttonholed Martin at one of their Birmingham gigs and asked if I could see the au pairs soundcheck at an upcoming London show. I'm not sure I even knew what a soundcheck was. I came to realise later that they could be incredibly boring. 15 minutes of the drummer going thump, thump, and 10 minutes of the road crew making noises into microphones. But this was all part of my eagerness to see more, to understand more. Martin said, of course, and I walked home happy I was going to get behind the scenes. One day in July 1980, having travelled down to London on a National Express coach, I turned up at the YMCA on Tottenham Court Road on the afternoon of an au pairs gig with the Passions and banged on the door. Eventually, someone let me in, and I went into the auditorium where Martin was standing. He didn't recognise me, let alone recall our encounter or my request. Over the sound of drummer Pete Hammond thumping, I attempted to tell the whole story. His promise, my journey. There was a pause. Martin looked at me. Something lumbering here now, he shouted. What? He raised his voice again. You're here now, you're here now. Yes, I'm here now, I yelled at him. Good, he said. And quite rightly, walked away to do something more important than having a deafening conversation with an anxious young man who'd somehow decided that attending an au pair's soundcheck would be a dream come true. 3 months later, I went to buy the NME, and Leslie from the au pairs was featured on the front cover. This accolade didn't mean the band was selling lots of records or that they were set for megastardom, but it struck me as a sign that something small, local, with undeniably prosaic roots could gain cultural significance. Being on the front of the NME was the mark of achievement in my eyes. When I interviewed Leslie, nearly 30 years later, she was living in East London. For some reason, it hadn't clicked that Leslie and guitarist Paul Fode were dating when the band began. The spikiness of their relationship was played out on stage and in the songs they co-wrote. In May 1983, the au pairs split up, and Leslie told me they'd never spoken to each other again. I quoted Walter Pater to her. To burn always with this hard gem-like flame, to maintain this ecstasy is success in life, Leslie. She laughed, clearly unconvinced. 90% of what we talked about that evening was unprintable. Who slept with whom, who took what drugs. In the other 10%, there was a story she told me about an encounter with Dexys Midnight Runners, specifically the band singer Kevin Rowland. She recalled how antagonistic Dexys could be. They used to go round in a gang, those boys. I think they liked intimidating people who they didn't like the look of. They were like real blokes, real lads. One evening, Dexys gatecrashed a party at Leslie's flat, which she shared with another woman. Some jewellery went missing, a diamond ring, and Leslie asked them to leave. When they wouldn't leave, she tried to knock Kevin Rowland off a chair. The next day, she tracked down Kevin's number and phoned him. I remember saying that there was a ring gone missing and it's very valuable, that one of his guys had taken it, and if they didn't give it me back, they'd have the police and Interpol on their back. Interpol? Oh, yeah, okay. I didn't know where all this bullshit was coming from. Anyway, he called me back. He sat in the room with me for about 3 hours talking about violence. I got the ring back. Amazing. When I interviewed Kevin at the Green Room in Manchester, I took the opportunity to ask him about this incident and told him about Leslie's memory of the event. It's something like that, he said. She came round to mine. I was shocked. We didn't know these people. They were from the other side of town. Moseley, middle-classy, studenty, CND. Different kind of thing to us completely. I was quite surprised she came around unannounced with some guy. What did she say? Kevin adopted a middle-classy student CND voice. What is this Dexys against the world thing, Kevin? What is it? What did you reply? I said, I don't know. I told Kevin that Leslie found it intriguing that he'd metamorphosed from someone that she thought was quite intimidating to someone who would sit down and talk about stuff. I don't think I had a lot of choice with her, he said. That green room interview was one of the 3 I did with Kevin in the 3 decades after I first saw Dexys play in 1979. Back then, I'd begun adventuring in the world of new bands, but I knew almost nothing about them. Someone said that a lad from school was in them, or was going to be in them, playing keyboards. I saw an A4 poster advertising a Dexys gig at a venue called Romulus along Hagley Road. I'd never been there, but it seemed too good to miss. Plus, the support band were Joy Division. I'd been hoping for a chance to see Joy Division, and here they were, playing not far from the #1 bus route which went past the end of our road. The Joy Division debut album, Unknown Pleasures, had just been released 6 or 7 weeks earlier. I'd heard tracks on John Peel. I'd bought it. Joy Division rejected punk formulas but drew on punk energy, reservoirs of personal anguish and relentless intellectual adventure. They questioned themselves with more ferocity than punk had questioned society. This is how Tony Wilson explained the shift. Punk enabled you to say, fuck you, but somehow it couldn't go any further. Sooner or later, someone was going to say, I'm fucked, and that was Joy Division. Joy Division hadn't exploded into the big time. The band were playing many unheralded venues. They were still some way short of selling the first 10,000 copies of Unknown Pleasures. I was confused more than anything by my first Joy Division concert. Despite the album reviews and the John Peel coverage, there were only 80 people there when Joy Division came on stage at Romulus. The sound system wasn't great, or something else had hampered the sound. I wasn't quite sure. I was expecting the very crisp sound on the album and to be pulled into the echoey spaces, but the band were a slightly chaotic, blurred noise, and the sound was a bit rushed. The most powerful part of the performance was how they looked on stage. They had intensity, all 4 individuals self-contained in a zone of their own. Drummer Stephen Morris, a little sideways on, not catching anyone's eye, appeared to be focused on some point in the middle distance. Hookie was fronting the audience, his bass low-hanging. Bernard was facing Ian, but not watching him, and Ian inhabited a force field, concentrated, electric. The most unexpected thing about the whole event was it appeared to be a mod night of some sort. Romulus was a haunt of the new generation of mods, and early Dexys appealed to that audience. I saw Joy Division 3 times. All the gigs were to some extent or other ramshackle or disconcerting or both. But ever since that Romulus gig, I've never been hung up on judging a live performance by how close it is to the sound of a record. If you want to hear the band just like on a record, you're best off staying in, listening at home. During a live show, I want the band to reveal something else, including their imperfections as musicians and or people. This especially seemed true of Joy Division, a group whose motivation and appeal seemed to be bound up with a struggle towards articulacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. That was a really brilliant piece. And that obviously that means a lot to me because I have a nice connection with Joy Division and I'm sure all our listeners do. But what I want to do is I want to go back to school with you. And were you academic at school?
Oh, yeah.
You were?
Can you not tell from that amazing little bit of extra of writing?
You've wrote enough bloody books. I thought you'd be half decent.
Books.
Yeah.
No, to be honest, I was when I say I was curious. Like earlier, I said how curious I was about discovering alternative culture. I was just generally a curious young man, and I read all the time. And back then, I used to read. There was a whole load of books called Penguin Modern Classics, which was a series of books, and I found a lot of them incomprehensible, but a lot of them ended up being very influential. And I loved them, so it was like Franz Kafka and Albert Camus. And that was kind of part of the alternative, that people at that point in the late 70s looking for ideas. And Mark E. Smith called The Fall after an Albert Camus novel, and Howard Devoto would reference Dostoevsky. So there was a sense that the music and the books all belonged in a world of ideas, and that world was something that we could find our own space in, and even maybe change. So I did.
And you made a connection.
I made a connection, and I found a space, and that idea of making a change was also part of the whole post-punk thing that I mentioned at the beginning of that extract. That idea in the late 70s that the Sex Pistols had somehow, they'd kind of thrown everything up in the air. And the idea really that I got from them was you can make your own culture. That everything from a fanzine to gluing the sleeve of your record together, being on an independent label, putting on bands, that sense of participation was really important. So all that kind of ended up coming together, I think, in my mind, the sense of an alternative, the sense that you could change culture, and the sense that you could change culture on a local level and it could have significance somehow to other people.
And did you feel that music and literature were going hand in hand for you at school, and you were given the freedom and influence?
Kind of. I mean, only that I was just I wasn't kind of analysing it. I just thought that I was interested in books. I was interested in.
And it seemed a very natural thing for you to.
Yeah, but the weird thing was that I'm not really, and those are still my two passions. But I was never that interested in, say, very supposedly literate songwriters.
Right.
So you'd kind of think somebody who was into books and into music would kind of be into kind of Dylan, for example. But I wasn't. What I liked about music was that it had a kind of visceral appeal, that it actually it bypassed your brain and went straight into your soul, whereas that's not what books did. But my brain needed feeding as well. So the things all worked for me, combined, I think. And so that's why I used to like seeing live bands, because I just loved being in a small room and just feeling, completely blasted by this power coming from the stage and the energy.
Yeah. So when you left school, and did your parents say, "So, Dave, what's the next step? What's the plan? What do you want
what are you
to
do?
That question.
Well, one of in the last chapter of the first chapter of the book, I talk about my mother dying, because what happened, I left Birmingham, moved to Manchester, and I never went back. I mean, partly because Manchester, for me, held so many attractions, and I felt very embedded, very welcome, very rooted there. I loved the music scene. It was everything that in my head I'd hoped it would be, and I would see Mark E. Smith in the pub, and I would see Pete Shelley in the alternative bookshop, and it was a very small world, that Manchester scene, very small, and actually not particularly celebrated at the time, but so it was easy to access and really wonderful. But also, as I talk about in my book, my mother died and the family kind of broke up, really, and all went and ended up living in different parts of the country. So my mother isn't alive to read my life story, but my father is, bless him, and he kept asking me what I was going to do, really up until about 4 years ago. Because, as I say, he's not part of the rock and roll generation. Actually, I mean, obviously he's getting on now. I took him a copy of the book, hand-delivered it to him, where he lives in Ludlow. He's retired, obviously, and he's in his mid-80s. And he said, he kind of started leafing through the book, and I could tell, I knew it was going to be all new to him. I mean, there's a chapter about growing up, and he'll like that, and he started reading the back, one of the flaps, and it says, he started reading it to me, and he said, from having Morrissey to tea. Morrissey, yeah, Morrissey, I remember that. A friend of yours, isn't he? Friend of yours. I'm like, yeah. To meeting writers such as Raymond Carver and Jonathan Franzen, to discussing masturbation with Viv Albertine. And I had that moment, even though I'm 56, where I didn't want my father to say the word masturbation. And Ecstasy with Rasheen Murphy. He looked at me and I thought, he's going to ask me about masturbation or ecstasy, which are obviously two of my favourite topics, as it turns out.
But obviously both quite awkward when discussing with your dad.
And he actually said, Rasheen, is that how you say her name? Which well got me off the hook. Yeah, so he basically has no idea what I do. He's never heard me DJ. But, you know, bless them, they were both very much of the mindset, if you're happy, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
So, you know, they didn't. And he kind of, he calmed down about what you're going to do, you know, once he realised that there wasn't really an answer, really.
I mean, we've touched on musical influences like Joy Division and The Fall, but when did dance music enter and come in for you? When did that come in? Because
Craig's read the book. He knows I had a moment.
They haven't read it, right, Dave. Okay. It's very
they haven't read it. So I had a moment. So I used to go to a club called Barbarella's in Birmingham. I was about 7. We haven't even got to Manchester yet, and we've been talking very interestingly for so long, Craig, but I'm really pleased about this 4-hour podcast. So I went to Barbarella's and I saw Iggy Pop and Blondie and lots of great things in this little club in Birmingham. And this band called Generation X were playing, and you know, my friends were like, let's go to see Generation X. With obviously Billy Idol was the front man. And we went, and it just didn't connect. You know, and that's the weird thing about that tribe or wearing a uniform. I've actually never really bought into everything that you need to be in a tribe. You know, I've often not worn the uniform, to be honest, and I've often not gone with the whole thing. I've not, like, if I'm into a band and they put out a bad record, I don't play it, I don't buy it, just, you know, anyway. Yeah. So I was like, I've said to my friend, I don't really get this Generation X. I'm going to wander down the corridor where I knew there was a disco room. And we never went in the disco room. So I walked down the corridor into the disco room, and it was empty, because nobody ever walked down into the disco room, especially when Generation X were playing. And I walked in, and the DJ must, you know, obviously excited he had a customer, and he threw down Can You Feel the Force by The Real Thing. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Can you feel the force? Yep. Yeah.
No, okay. I thought everybody was going to join in then for a second, Dave. No.
And obviously, the 700 people who are here will know that song. And at that moment, I just thought, I absolutely loved it. I mean, obviously, it's not the trendiest disco record ever, but I'm just like, okay, wherever I am, whatever I do, I'm always going to walk down that corridor to the disco room. I'm always now, from this moment, I'm going to have one foot in the live room and one foot in the disco. And that was 1979. And so that's it. That's how I've always been since that moment.
So the lesson there is walk into your disco room, wherever your disco room may be.
Well, walk through the doors is always an important thing. I think that is one of the things that I realised when I was writing the book. Obviously, when you write a book, you have all the little details, but then you end up thinking, well, what's the architecture of the book? How does it all hang together? It's not necessarily a theme, but it's just something that you realise is emerging and is there, and is a connection maybe between, you know, me now and me age 33 or 23 or 17. And that architecture it becomes important because it's a way of shaping all those little details. And I realized that one of the themes of the book, and hence my life, I guess, is that I have always knocked on doors, you know, literally and metaphorically, that
Where does that come from?
And I don't know really where that comes from. I think it comes from that extreme curiosity thing. And also that this is how I actually feel that somehow it's maybe you're a bit maybe people can be unsettled at points in their lives, or just generally unsettled with who they are, where they are, who they're with. And there's that sense, it's like knocking on a door and going through into a different world. And I think that, it's like the Midnight Garden or whatever that book's called, where you go through a door and it's like a dream world. But actually sometimes you go through that door and it's not the dream world, it's the real world. And you've entered it somehow.
Yeah.
And you've entered it just because either someone's given you the key, or you've just thought, I'm going to go through it. And metaphorically and literally, I just feel like I'm either through being unsettled or curious or confident or whatever. Brave. So literally, 1983, I'm doing a little fanzine in Manchester. I knock on the door of the manager of the Smiths and say, can I interview Morrissey? And that's kind of how I've operated, really.
But that's great self-belief without arrogance. That's a brave and great self-belief. So do you think that comes from your father or your mother, or?
I don't honestly, I don't know where that self-belief comes from. I think it comes from, and I still have. Self-belief it makes it sound like it's, I don't have reservations about what I'm doing. But if you imagine my life now, and my life, in fact, for the last however many decades, I walk into clubs and I go behind the decks and I inflict my favorite music very loudly on a bunch of strangers who've paid good money. Now, you have to have a certain amount of self-belief to do that, to be the person who gets on that stage and goes behind those decks. But that doesn't mean that I don't get anxious before the gig. It doesn't mean that, in the days of vinyl, I remember sometimes my hand used to shake as I put the stylus onto the record, certainly at the beginning of a set.
Do you still get nervous now?
I still get nervous now. I get nervous about every single gig. And then when you put books out, you're also putting yourself, not, on a stage of sort, you're also putting your head above the parapet.
But also you're putting yourself out there.
And in this book, I'm absolutely.
Absolutely.
So the self-belief isn't without reservations, and it doesn't mean that I've ever felt like the kind of person who can just cut a swathe through popular culture in a kind of superhero way to get what I want. I've not ever been that person. I've always been that person who's like full of doubt and full of anxiety and keeping my fingers crossed, and I still am, even though I've DJed thousands of times and I've had 5 books out. It doesn't get any easier. So the idea of self-belief is a complicated thing.
I think it is, but I think if you put that record on or whatever, you weren't nervous, you didn't have a little bit of anxiety, then maybe the passion's gone. I know for myself that if I'm acting and I go out on stage and I go, I'll just do this and say that there's nothing there, it's dead, then the performance is going to be dead. So I'm sure, would that be the same thing?
Yeah, the thing with DJing is that not every gig is going to be amazing, because sometimes that connection with the audience isn't there. But I'm often surprised by how that connection with the audience is there, and sometimes it's a gig that I'm not expecting much from.
Can you tell when it's not there immediately, or is it something that grows?
Yeah, but then I work on it. You have the strategies for trying to make it work and finding that record that changes the atmosphere and brings people in. And I talk quite in the book about the kind of, not exactly the psychology of DJing, but I try and break down, because the weird thing about writing about your own life is there's a lot of things that have either just happened that you can't really analyze 5 reasons why it happened, you know. So there's things like, selling my records, falling out with Tony Wilson, some of the stuff we've talked about. I haven't got like explanations for all those things, and so you don't, as you're writing it, you're kind of realizing that at some points you just have to say, like anybody who's lived a life, actually I don't really know why I did that. I don't know how that happened.
It just happened.
It just happened, but the important thing is to kind of acknowledge it and to try and work out where you were at that one particular time. And in the same way, a lot of DJing is, in a way, instinctive. You know, I kind of instinctively know how I want the night to go and what I want to play. So I challenge myself to try and break down that instinct and to try and work out actually what is going on in my head at those points when I'm DJing. And I think I kind of call it like psychology, anthropology. You know, you're looking at the audience and you're trying to actually connect with a few people. And you might pick out people in the crowd and you think, they understand it. I'm gonna work them. You'll see some guy at the bar who thinks he knows a lot more about music than you do, who's just there to sneer and go back to his mates and say, that Dave Haslam's shit. But you pick him out immediately and ignore him the whole night. You never attempt to bring him in onto the dance floor because you know that that's not what he wants. He wants to go home with his preconceptions firmly. So you can't, it's usually girls, you know, girls are the best thing about clubs, and they are, you know, or gay men, to be honest, because I just think usually they're first on the dance floor. And I actually remember there was one of those sneery type guys once said to a friend of mine, Dave Haslam, I don't rate him. And my friend said, oh, why? You know, he seems successful enough. Music for girls. And that was like somehow he decided in his head that was like the worst thing you could do. But, you know, Ain't Nobody is the greatest dance record ever made, you know? And if that's music for girls, then guilty as charged.
And just going back to the book, how easy or painful or difficult, sorry, that's a lot of things, to go back and recall all that stuff from your early life and try and piece it all together? Did it come naturally to you?
I enjoyed writing it. I guess one of the things that people sometimes think about a book like this is how therapeutic or whatever it might have been, and there was an element of that in it. Yeah. But also, so I kind of enjoyed that aspect of it. Weirdly, the bits that I didn't enjoy were the bits that I know are in the public domain. So the 80s, certainly when I started doing the fanzine, writing an NME, working at the Hacienda, putting on bands, Sonic Youth Sleeping on My Floor, I loved all those years. And I really enjoyed writing about them because I knew that the readers weren't familiar with any of that stuff. The hard bit became when kind of 1988 and the whole culture explodes. And all the people that I'd been talking about in 1986, 87, like this funny band called Happy Mondays and this bunch of goths called the Stone Roses and this strange man who didn't know if he loved or hated me called Tony Wilson. All these people suddenly became big. And this little club that I was DJing at for £40 a night suddenly became the epicenter of the music universe. Now, we all think we know that story of the Hacienda and Manchester and Spike Island and Acid House and all that. So actually, for me, the challenge in writing the book was how to write about that period of my life, but in a way that was obviously interesting to a reader, but also honest to how I remember things, and not not really tarnished or influenced by all the mythology and the history we all know about. So that was the hardest bit. And then after the hacienda and the kind of, the sort of various things that I get up to in the last 15 years, in a way they become easy to write about. A lot of it is darker stuff, but actually the darker stuff was easier to write about than the stuff which, as I say, I think everybody feels like they know.
Does DJing ever feel like a job to you? Or do you still have the passion for it?
I still have the passion. I'm addicted to it. Absolutely addicted to it. And I will DJ until I arrive somewhere and there's nobody there,
So therefore it doesn't feel like a job?
Yeah, I mean, even if when it gets to that point, that it'll be over, because it is about the connection with an audience. A DJ without an audience is just, somebody with a bunch of records, it's like you have to have an audience, and I'm lucky in that I can, I try, and I'm quite choosy about my gigs. I usually end up enjoying them, and about 1 out of every 4 I absolutely love, and that feeds my addiction.
What do you mean when you say you're choosy about your gigs?
Well, I get offered the kind of, will you come to Dry Bar, which is like I think it's now closed, but it was like a kind of a bar on Oldham Street in Manchester, opposite Affleck's Palace, where you got your salmon kickers from, and it's all connected, and it was owned by Factory Records at one point, and then sold on and went through various owners. But I'd get like, will you come and DJ at the Dry Bar, 20th birthday party, we'll give you, whatever, 800 quid to play for an hour Manchester classics. I'm like, I cannot think of anything worse. And just because I wouldn't have the passion. I love those records, and I've had a drink in Dry Bar, and I want to celebrate your birthday. But actually, as a DJ, I do have that, as you say, that need to keep feeling the passion and feeling excited. And in 1988, 89, I was in love with those records because they were new. I wasn't in love with those records because they filled the dance floor easily. I wasn't in love with those records because they, whatever, they were big records. I just loved them because they were new and exciting. And so I'd rather take a gig. So if somebody says, I've got a basement club, 200 people, we'll give you 80 quid. There'll only be 200 people there. We just want a party.
Yeah.
We don't care what you play. I'll take that gig. I'll take that gig. That was you, Leo. Yeah.
Well, it sounds perfect. I think I want to end it. I want to throw out some questions to the audience if anybody's got any Q&As. But what I want to ask you is, are you happy? Are you
I really
happy?
wish I'd listened to more of your podcasts before.
Well, it's a thing that I stole.
But also,
from...
the other thing which I'm aware of is that I actually find you a really interesting person, and I kind of wish that we'd had a bit more interaction. Can I ask you?
You can ask me anything.
Because the weird thing is that in the book, all these things, and my age, mid-50s, things start to come round full circle. So music comes round full circle. But also, sadly, a number of the people that I knew back then have died, and you go to a funeral and you meet people again, and then, things keep popping up from your past, like, I guess, anyone in the mid-50s. And also, kind of, you walk around streets which end up feeling a bit like they're full of ghosts, or you go to venues and you look around and you have all these memories, and it's kind of it's a bit disorientating, and I'm finding it quite hard to deal with. But one of the weird things for me is then meeting people who have a connection with that, meeting their children or whatever. And it really freaked me out when I first met you, because you played Tony Wilson.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, so dear Tony, I was kind of, I was used to, dealing with amounts of antagonism with him when he was alive. He was somebody who opened the doors. Talk about opening doors. He gave me the key to a load of doors, loads of opportunities. But he was always a little bit of a hard person to work with. I think if you were outside, you could sense his vision and how amazing he was. But on a day-to-day level, like any pressurized type work colleague, sometimes people got irritated or exasperated, either him with me or me with him. So I'd kind of got, and then of course he died, but then he lives on, and people are always saying, asking about Tony and doing events connected with the Hacienda. And I'm just kind of getting used to Tony's presence as a ghost, who still is somebody who influences what I feel and what I do. And then you come along, and you're like somebody who played Tony in a film, and I'm like, this is just getting deeper. This is getting deeper. Did you learn anything about Tony from my book that you wish you'd known before you played him?
No, because I grew up with him, watching Granada Reports. I used to have my tea in front of him, so I knew our version of Tony. And luckily, when I was filming, I was always dodging him because I didn't want to meet him before I filmed. And he came onto set just before one of my biggest scenes, and I met him, and I was wearing, because it was all shot in black and white, the film control, and I had a brown velvet suit, and we were doing research, and because we were shooting in black and white, we can get away with it because he wore black. And he came up to me with his dogs, and he didn't say hello, he went, "That's wrong, I wore black." And just before I was about to film, and it just completely crushed me. And then afterwards I spoke to him, and he was really lovely and amazing, but it was breaking the myth of Tony. And I was really careful. I wanted to be very careful about how he was portrayed. In answer to your question, yeah.
I mean, obviously, I think in Control, you portray him with more warmth, obviously, than 24. He's portrayed in 24-Hour Party People, which I think is good, because in 24-Hour Party People, it gets pretty lacerated. Really.
Yeah, but two very different films that stand equally, and people will have different memories of both of those bits of those films. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dave Haslam.
Thank you.
Another episode is done. How lovely was that? Dave is just a lovely guy. And if you were intrigued and you want to find out more, or maybe you didn't even know anything about Dave, his book now is available. It's called Sonic Youth Slept on My Floor. You can get it where they sell books. So grab yourself a copy and dive into that scene. What else? Next week's episode 46. It's another live one. It's with Mr. Paddy Considine. I don't want to say too much, but I will tell you, it's a cracker. It's a really, really good episode. And from day one since we started the podcast, and people do throw suggestions at us all the time, which we love, we're not adverse to that, but we've got a really long list of people at the moment that we're trying to get through. But Paddy was always on that list, and I knew how hard it was to get someone like Paddy. He doesn't do a lot of podcasts, he doesn't do loads of interviews, so to get him was a real thrill. And he did not disappoint. It was absolutely lovely spending time with him. What else? Also, I don't know, you listen to all sorts of things, I'm sure, but if you do listen to Desert Island Discs on BBC Radio 4, like I do all the time, I think I've got it set as a podcast, so it comes through after every Sunday. this week, the week just gone, it was David Baddiel, the comedian and author. Go back and listen to it. Sometimes with Sometimes with Desert Island Discs, with the time frame, they only sort of skim the surface of the guest. And the great thing about David Baddiel is he throws himself out there. All his work is very confessional about his life and about him. Really go back and listen to that Desert Island Discs, and then we'll have a chat next week about how many times you cried. I think I was 2.5, Virgin on 3. Don't let that put you off. It's a really beautiful episode. So, thanks so much for joining us. I've been Craig Parkinson. He's been producer Griff, and this has been the Two Shot Podcast. Until next week, stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye. The Two Shot Podcast is presented by me, Craig Parkinson, recorded and produced by Thomas Griffin for Splicing Block. Our brilliant music is courtesy of Then Thickens. Cheers.